With Etheria having been out for a few months, players have already figured out how to clear endgame content, and more importantly, they've also figured out what the strongest teams actually look like in said fights. As a result, in today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into Doki Doki at the highest difficulty levels from Hell 3 all the way up to Inferno. We'll break down which teams you should be bringing, how to build around important mechanics, and everything else you need to know to clear these stages efficiently. But if you found today's video helpful or learned something new, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks again to Etheria Restart though for sponsoring today's video, and without further ado, let's get into it. Now before we get into the teams themselves, there are a few important things to keep in mind. There's quite a bit of variety when it comes to what units you can use to clear Doki Doki, but many of the fastest and most consistent Inferno clears tend to rely on specifically Romoka because of her ability to use her skill 3 twice if she kills multiple enemies with it. That said, there are players clearing without Romoka, so this guide isn't meant to tell you it's impossible without her alone. Instead, it's here to fill the gaps for players who are struggling with Inferno, or for those that are preparing to take on Inferno in the near future. As always though, if you're someone who's just getting started with the game, there's no reason to rush into Inferno. It's much better if you just progress through the game naturally rather than trying to force your way to the end game before you're ready. Now on the topic of best one-shot team, I did a pretty long ramble and analysis in my past Terramaton video breaking down whether the fastest clear on the leaderboard is realistic or even worth following. To summarize quickly, it's often not, as there can be multiple layers of RNG that can affect said run. However, when it comes to generally one of the fastest one-shot teams for Doki Doki, there actually is a standout lineup here, and that includes Romoka, Kazuya the Reverie, Klaus, Yang, and Lily. Now at a glance, this team setup is fairly straightforward, but the speed tuning might throw you off a bit. Rather than expect Lily to take turn 1, Klaus starts off the first wave with the defense break, followed by Kazuya putting the entire team to sleep with their skill 3. With the enemies now both debuffed and unable to act, Yang applies his attack and crit rate buff to the entire team, then Lily uses her skill 2 on Romoka, who then takes the turn and deletes the entire wave after they've lost their damage reduction with her skill 3. Now with the second wave, things may seem bleak since we've already used all our skills, but what actually ties this team together and saves us here is the fact that both Klaus and Kazuya are equipped with Codex of Magic, meaning that their skill 3s are also reset thanks to these shells passives. As a result, the same setup, defense break, sleep, then one shot, can actually be executed again seamlessly. That said, much like any other team, this comp is subject to RNG. If Kazuya fails to land sleep on any enemies during the setup, those mobs will keep their 90% damage reduction buff, which completely ruins the one shot, causes the run to take much longer, and throws off the otherwise perfect tuning in this clear. To add to this, of course, if Klaus ends up missing a defense break, well, nothing ends up getting one shot, and as you'd imagine, you're at the mercy of RNG. Now let's talk about stats and build for this setup, however. Lily will ideally be 280 to 290 speed with as much bulk as you can put on her, and for her shell, Artisan is the best choice as it makes your team a lot tankier with the shield it gives. For the set, however, 12-piece Swift Rush is her priority, and in most cases her second set doesn't matter here too much. Now Yang only needs enough speed here to cut ahead of Romoka after being pushed up by Lily. With this, just having roughly 260 speed with 12-piece Swift Rush as his main set will be ideal. His second set doesn't really matter as usual though, and for this fight specifically, you'll honestly just want as much bulk as possible on him so he doesn't die to random hits. Klaus is a little more difficult to build, and you'll want her with 200 effect accuracy and enough speed to take turn 1. As a result, you'll honestly be looking for 290 to 300 speed with as much bulk as you can fit afterward, but most importantly here is her Codex of Magic shell with her main module set being Swift Rush and Time Weaver as her secondary. As a reminder, if you increase or decrease the speed of Klaus, this does mean that you'll have to speed tune and keep the order of the other characters in line. With this means that if Klaus ends up being slower, Lily will also have to drop in speed too. On that note, however, Kazuya is very similar to Klaus in build. She needs 200 effect accuracy with 280 to 290 speed, and this can also be chalked up to just being faster than Lily but slower than Klaus with Codex of Magic as her shell as well. For her set though, you'll also want Swift Rush as her 12-piece main set with Time Weaver as her secondary once again. Finally, however, we have Romoka. Romoka will ideally want 3000 attack, 55 crit rate before any buffs of the team, and at least 300 crit damage for her stats. She'll also want Momentum to be her 12-piece set and Fury to be her 8-piece set, but the shell you'll want on her is Count, as this gives 1000 attack and lifesteal for the user. Now for transparency's sake, Count is equally as important as Codex of Magic for this lineup, as in most cases, Romoka can't actually kill these enemies without the attack increase. Now for lattices, if you need speed, you could consider maybe upgrading Lily's S1, although it's definitely not necessary for this fight specifically, but otherwise you'll want to max Klaus's S3, max the S3 and S1 for Kazuya, and max S3 for for Vilmoka. However, to be fair, you may want to invest in her other skills as she gains base stat increases, and this clear is pretty much dependent on her damage. However, with all this out of the way, I'd like to remind you that this is a team that requires a lot of golden lattice, so keep this in mind before you invest in it. For the average player who isn't looking to fine-tune a dedicated one-shot team for Doki Doki, there are still plenty of solid and accessible options that require far less investment. One of the most commonly used teams is Zyada, Freya, Valerian, Klaus, and Kazuyo the Reverie. Now, unlike more burst-focused lineups, this team plays at a slower pace, allowing Zyada to gradually ramp up her damage through her passive. The setup, though, is relatively simple. Klaus provides the defense break, Kazuyo adds crowd control via sleep, and Freya handles team utility by applying attack and defense buffs while also debuffing the enemies to take more damage. Now, Valerian's role here is to protect the team, ensuring that no one gets unexpectedly one-shot, especially during early turns. Altogether, it's a very standard Zyada-centric team that doesn't rely on complex mechanics or tight cooldown rotations. You let Zyada scale, and she clears the fight in due time. Now, if you don't have Zyada though, Rosa is also a strong alternative, particularly when equipped with Revelation. In some cases, if all debuffs land properly, Rosa can even one-shot the first wave, speeding up the run significantly. That said, it's worth acknowledging the RNG aspect of this team. If your DPS happens to get focused by multiple enemies at the start of the fight, there is very little you can do even with Valerian's Hazy Dream passive. Like the RNG checks of the fast team, this team can also technically fail if damage gets out of control early on. So again, while this team is viable and consistent enough for most players, it's not completely immune to RNG, so just be aware of that risk if you plan to run it. For stats, Klaus and Kazuyo's stat line for this are very similar to the original one-shot, except you can definitely make the units way slower if you need to. For Klaus, you still want her at 200 effect accuracy, but now she'll still be fine with around 250 to 260 speed with as much bulk as you can fit. Her shell is also different, with it now being Artisan or Jackal Guard, and her main set is Swift Rush with Time Weaver as her secondary. Kazuyo, however, is very similar to Klaus in this build, and with this she'll still want 200 effect accuracy with 240 to 250 speed and Artisan as her shell. Now for her set, just like with Klaus, Swift Rush will be her main and Time Weaver will be her secondary module set as well. Now for Zyada, her build is also extremely simple. She just wants 3000 attack, 100 crit rate, and as much crit damage as you can get, preferably reaching above 300. Her passive does also give her crit damage and attack though, so you shouldn't worry too much if you can't hit these stats, as her passive will give you more stats in the long run. For her shell though, she really prefers Revelation, and for her sets, she wants Momentum for her 12 set and Fury for her 8 set. Now Valerian's build is the most simple by far. You want as much health as you can stack on her, so using Wellspring is a must. Before her secondary, using something like Time Weaver for the cooldown is nice too, though again this may affect things negatively if you can only clear because of it. For a more precise number to aim for, however, 36,000 HP is more than enough, and for her shell she prefers Gigabyte, as this allows her to complete the matrix sets on her modules. Freya's build, however, will be a bit more complicated than Valerian's. You'll ideally want 270 speed with 200 effect accuracy on her, and you'll also want her to be a bit tanky, as she will be more prone to getting one shot. Now with this, her shell will also ideally be Artisan, as it gives her more survivability, and for her sets she'll prefer 12-piece Swift Rush and Time Weave 8-piece. For lattices, you'll ideally once again want to max Klaus's skill 3, max the skill 3 and skill 1 of Kazuyo, max S2 and S3 on Zyada, and max skill 3 on Valerian. Now there is an important distinction that needs to be made between farming for health 3/health 4 and farming Inferno in Doki Doki. Understanding this difference is important for players trying to push higher difficulties / reach the endgame of Etheria restart, as resources and investment of your characters will matter a lot depending on what you're farming. In health 4, all enemies are protected by a 50% damage reduction buff, which is already a decent hurdle, but clearable depending on what you have. However, in Inferno, that same buff is increased to 90%, making it far more punishing for any team that isn't specifically built around removing it. This means brute forcing the damage reduction in prior fights like Hell 4 and below is simply too difficult, and as a result, you'll need to deal with the mechanic properly. This damage reduction is only dispelled when enemies are hit with crowd control effects, such as freeze, sleep, or stun, and so if you're not bringing reliable crowd controllers into the fight, you're going to struggle with bursting anything down. To make matters worse, the enemies in Inferno also apply injury to your units, permanently lowering their max HP with each hit they take. With time, this means that you will eventually succumb to and lose all chances of clearing if you take too long. Now in theory though, Inferno is beatable. However, if you're missing characters like Messiah, Zyada, or Vilmoka, if your units aren't properly geared, or if you're missing the debuffers to handle the 90% damage reduction and HP injury effects, it's completely reasonable and even advisable to stick with Hell 3 until your roster is better paired. The extra resources gained from Inferno aren't really worth the frustration if your runs are constantly failing and you you inevitably start losing energy, and as with Terramaton and all fights in this game, coming back later after having farmed better sets / gear for your characters is totally fine. To wrap things up though, clearing Doki Doki, especially on Inferno, is all about understanding the mechanics and really having the right characters to invest in. Whether you're using the top tier one-shot team comp with Rilmoka and Lily, or if you opt for a more stable and slow team like Ziada / Freya, what matters most here is consistency and control. Inferno's 90% damage reduction and HP injury mechanic makes it far more punishing than Hell 4, so if your roster isn't ready, there's no shame in sticking with Hell 4 or Hell 3 for now. Bring crowd control, watch out for RNG, and build around units you can rely on right now, and with the right strategy, even Inferno will eventually become manageable. Thanks again for watching though, guys, and also a huge thank you to Etheria Restart for sponsoring today's video. As always though, guys, hope you guys enjoyed or learned something. Stay safe, stay healthy, good night.